Welcome everyone. It's Wednesday morning and we're back again with another session for the Farmland, Drainage and the Environment Conference. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Trevor Herriot with Public Pastures Public Interest. So before we get started today, I'd just like to acknowledge the numerous treaties across Saskatchewan. So that includes treaty number 2, number 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, many treaties. Saskatchewan is also the ancestral home of the Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota Assiniboine, Dakota, Lakota Sioux, and the Dene Siouxland people. Saskatchewan is also the traditional home of the Métis Nation, and I just want to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people who have lived and taken care of this land for many centuries. This conference is brought to you by the Citizens Environmental Alliance and many like-minded organizations, and our goal here is to increase the awareness of the different imperatives around farmland drainage. So a few housekeeping notes. Your mics are all on mute. We have a question box that you can enter your questions throughout the presentation, and we have time dedicated at the end of the presentation where I'll be asking the questions directly to Trevor. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Trevor Herriot is a naturalist, grassland conservationist, and the author of several award-winning books, including Grass, Sky, and Song, and the national bestseller, River in a Dry Land. He has published essays and articles in the Globe and Mail and Canadian Geographic. Herriot also appears regularly on CBC Radio Saskatchewan's Birdline and has been featured in several documentaries, including Grasslands, A Hidden Wilderness, which appeared on The Nature of Things. He and his wife Karen live in Regina and spend much of their time on a piece of Aspen Parkland prairie east of the city. So with that, Trevor, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Lindsay. I'd like to thank Lindsay and Caitlin for putting up with me and putting together this platform. Over the last few days, we've had a couple glitches we had to work through, and seems to be working quite well now. So I'm just going to get my PowerPoint thing going here. And I wanted to also thank Jeff and everybody else at Citizens Environmental Alliance for putting together this whole program in December and January and allowing us to, share some thoughts like this, hold a series and bring some attention to what's happening to water and wetlands in Saskatchewan. As a bit of context for my remarks and to remind us a bit of the gravity of the work we're undertaking here, I'd like to draw your attention to a sobering report in today's news, this morning's news. The Guardian today has a report on a statement by a group of 17 scientists from the US, Mexico, and Australia, urging the world to wake up to the twin crises of biodiversity collapse and climate change. I'm going to quote a little bit from that report. The report warns that climate-induced mass migrations, more pandemics, and conflicts over resources will be inevitable unless urgent action is taken. They say, ours is not a call to surrender. We aim to provide leaders with a realistic cold shower of the state of the planet that's essential for planning to avoid a ghastly future. They say dealing with the enormity of the problem requires far-reaching changes to global capitalism, education, and equality. These include abolishing the ideas of perpetual economic growth, properly pricing environmental externalities, stopping the use of fossil fuels, reining in corporate lobbying, and empowering women. So we've seen reports like this before, of course. As the urgency increases, I guess we can only hope that more people in power will begin to listen and that maybe we'll begin to see some of these changes and soon. Okay, before I continue, I want to read you a little quote from one of the people I think is the greatest writer of landscape, culture, and nature, a man who wrote with such deep empathy and compassion for other animals and for human cultures and their connections to the land. I'm talking about Barry Lopez here, who just died recently. He was the author of Arctic Dreams, of Wolves and Men, many other important books. He died a couple weeks ago on Christmas Day, actually. And last summer, the fires, probably driven by climate change in the West, tore right through his land in Oregon. His home, his beautiful home there, survived but he lost an outbuilding that had some important material that he was going to be submitting to the archive in Texas that keeps all of his notes and papers. So here is the quote, which speaks to much of what I hope to address in my remarks today. He says, "The geographies of North America, the small myriad landscapes that make up the national fabric, are threatened by ignorance of what makes them unique, by utilitarian attitudes, by failure to include them in the moral universe, and by brutal disregard." By ignorance of what makes them unique, by utilitarian attitudes, by failure to include them in the moral universe. So this is what I want to talk about in our relations to our particular unique geography in this corner of the continent, which I'm saying is the Aspen Parkland and its mosaic of wetlands, bush, and grassland. And I'm not going to talk so much about the brutal disregard part, but more about the ignorance of what makes it unique, our utilitarian way of regarding it, and that failure to include the land and all of its creatures in our moral universe. So lately, I've been digging through old back issues of a journal called The Blue Jay, which comes from Saskatchewan. It's the Journal of Nature Saskatchewan. It dates back to the late 1940s, even before the origins of Nature Sask. I've got hard copies of the originals, but now it's free and online, available and searchable as well on the Nature Saskatchewan website, which makes it a terrific resource and a little bit unappreciated, I think. And in fact, I kind of see the old Blue Jay as being one of those resources to help us become better acquainted with the unique geography in this part of the world. It's got this terrific mix of natural history and actual science. So there's lots of little notes and reports by prairie people just out observing the world. And they're right beside scientific papers, you know, on prairie insects, plants, and ecology. For example, recently I came across an article by Jordan Ignatiuk, who happens now to be the executive director of Nature Saskatchewan. He was working with Dave Duncan, and they did a study looking at wetland loss in Saskatchewan. It was published in 1990. Very interesting to read. I'm sure some of you would enjoy it too. But what I really love and find most interesting in the Blue Jay are the older reports from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s from farmers and ranchers who were also naturalists. I stumbled across an article written almost exactly 50 years ago by a farmer named Willie Niven. Niven ran a beef cattle operation near the town of Shiho, which is near the Quill Lakes. He had about 7 quarters of land at the time. So this is written in the 1970s, 1970 actually. The title of the article is "The Land, the Birds Through 50 Years of Aspen Parkland." It's a report on the changes to the land and bird life that he was seeing in the Aspen Parkland around his farm next to Salt Lake, which is a few miles north of Shiho. It's fascinating reading his report, partly because I'm looking at it from sort of a personal, selfish perspective, because the guy was my age at the time, and he was thinking about the same things I think about. But he was thinking about the previous 50 years, from 1920 to 1970. And 1970 is about when I kind of started to pay attention, because I was a young person out hunting with my father. And so I know that's another 50-year period. So together, from 1920 to today, 2020, we've got 100 years of paying attention to the Aspen Parklands, woods and wetlands and grasslands, and watching them be transformed. But Mr. Niven came with his parents from Scotland in 1910. He and his brother, in fact, in 1970, when he wrote the article, were still farming the original 2 quarters on their homestead and 5 more. In the article, he talks about becoming interested in birds as a boy at school, because back in those days, prairie curriculums in the old small schoolhouses included natural history. Children were expected to learn how to identify wildflowers, common wildflowers, and birds. But anyway, as a farmer, he just observed things while he was doing his daily rounds with the cattle and his crops. And in fact, he kept spring arrival dates for birds every year. He had a list of 181 species. He kept these in 4 copies of a little booklet that he called the Farmer's Pocket Ledger. It was provided free by John Deere. This is what it looked like. Now, I want to be careful here. I don't want to romanticize this story or make it sound like all we need to do is return to the golden age when farmers were all like William Niven, because that wouldn't be fair, and it would be incorrect on many, many levels. But I do want to say that while farmers like William Niven were perhaps the exception even then, they were not that uncommon. In fact, the blue jay was founded by people like William, Blue Jay in Nature Saskatchewan. He was an original subscriber and a member of Nature Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan Natural History Society at the time. Farmers and ranchers and people who grew up on prairie farms were the backbone of that organization and regularly reported their observations to the journal. It'd be easy, I guess, to speculate that today it's harder for a farmer to find time to be recording bird sightings, and maybe even that the way farming is conducted is less conducive to paying that much attention. But I think we need to remember that these kinds of rural people still exist today. I know many of them. When I do that phone-in call-in show on CBC on birds, farmers call in with the things they're seeing, and I'm always impressed at how observant they are compared to urban people. And between shows, they often will email me or phone me with questions and observations. So here's a little note I just received yesterday from a farmer near Melfort. He said, this is an active bird winter. The mild conditions likely help with feeding and bird survival. The redpolls are here again today, he says. He says, we live in a heavily wooded area that's rocky and sandy ridge. There's lots of trees here. Likely habitat pressure is forcing birds into our nearby forest. What he means by habitat pressures, he goes on to talk about how farmers have tried to remove a lot of the trees, but there's rocks left over in those landscapes that have been stopping them from actually cultivating. He says one farmer destroyed 35 acres of trees 15 years ago, but couldn't bring it to cultivation because of massive rocks. He continually sprays it now. We just call it a dead zone. And he says they've lived on their land since 1978. He's been an organic farmer since 1994. He says we do what we can to protect the habitat. He goes on to talk about the evening grosbeaks, the juncos, the rough grouse. He clearly knows the birds. He's got northern goshawks nesting in the bush. He's been noticing a drop in some of the birds because of that, and the squirrels as well. Anyway, so I just want to read that to show you that we still do have farmers like Mr. William Niven. I think it's important to remember that. They may be a silent minority, and perhaps there are fewer today than there were back in 1970, but of course there are fewer farmers in general, as we all know. And it's fair to say as well, we need to remember that much of the habitat that does remain on private land today is in the hands of farmers who genuinely care about the bush and sloughs and grass they manage. People like that fellow who wrote into me. And perhaps that for every landowner who succeeds in retaining habitat on his land, there are probably quite a few more who are just not proud of the fact that they've been bulldozing and draining areas that their parents and grandparents would be sad to see destroyed. Anyway, in Niven's article on 50 years of observing the Aspen Parkland where he lived, he laments the loss of sloughs, bush, and grass in the area, especially the bulldozing that he was already seeing in 1970. He talks about the effects of overgrazing, the removal of aspen bluffs, the drainage of sloughs, just as we do today, 50 years later. Now, I guess we'd love to have the habitat that he saw in 1970 because we know so much more has been lost. But here's how he closed the article. Just remember, this is 1970. He says, in conclusion, I predict that there will be a great deal more wildlife habitat destroyed in our district as time goes on. Our need of birds, animals, trees, and flowers will continue to decrease. Our natural resources, in my opinion, have a value that transcends economics in providing beauty, variety, and an interest outside our daily work, without which life would be drab indeed. I therefore wish to suggest that more wildlife sanctuaries be established in suitable locations, particularly along rivers and lakes, before these areas too are cleared for pasture. There are still many such places which are better suited for wildlife than for any other purpose. Now is the time to plan land use in order to retain wildlife for future generations. Now is the time. That was 50 years ago. He wrote that. So I can't help wondering what remains of those 800 acres that Mr. Niven farmed, because of course he's gone now. And that's what we do, right? In prairie conservation world, we think a lot about the changes in land over 10, 20, 50 years. And of course, we think about the causes driving it, which all goes back to the ways we grow and process and distribute food. But that is not my topic today. I'm not going to say any more about the damage, the degradation, and the loss, and I'm not even going to talk about how we could prevent it, stop it, or reverse it. Instead, I just want to say a few things about the way we look at the wild, uncultivated landscapes around us, the way we value them. So here's a list of some of the common ways we try to argue for the value of what we call nature. It's adapted from a list written a few years ago by a director for the Nature Conservancy, David Braun. First is the practical argument. If we keep losing species diversity on the planet, sooner or later, it's going to hurt us, right? You pop enough rivets on the plane and eventually it'll crash. Then there's the economic argument, which is probably the most common one. Saving nature saves on costs for things like pollination and pest management. It offers income opportunities for tourism, harvesting wild species, etc. There's the aesthetic argument. Our lives are enriched by the beauty of nature. It informs our arts and culture, etc. There's a psychological argument, which we've been hearing a lot of this year under the pandemic, that we need green spaces because it helps us function better. It's good for our mental health. There's the climate change argument, of course, which is becoming more important. The natural cover stores carbon, helps communities handle floods and droughts that are caused by climate change. And there's the research argument that wild plants, for example, have the potential to solve human problems, whether they're medical or otherwise. Half of modern medicines can be traced back to wild organisms, we hear. Then finally, there's the generational responsibility argument that we must leave our children and grandchildren a rich and abundant world. Now, these are all very good arguments representing important values. Willie Niven, in fact, was using those same arguments at the end of his article. But if we look at this list, you'll notice one thing pretty quick. All of these values point back to human beings. The value for us, pollinators, beauty, climate change effects, medicine, mental health, all for the benefit of human survival and flourishing, which of course is not a surprise. This is the kind of thinking that's the stock and trade of humanity and of conservation NGOs. So we need wetlands because, and the because always points back to us. So why is it? Well, I kind of think it's because we've come to think that humanity runs entirely and only on individual self-interest. It's right there in our economic understanding of human behavior. It's even in our religions, from the Protestant work ethic onward through modern fundamentalist Christianity. This self-interested economic lens and language, I believe, is our heritage as Western Europeans. It's baked right into our colonial legacy. And it has hurt people who've been colonized on this continent and throughout the world, displacing their own cultural lens on life with one that says that everything in nature must have a use, a purpose to justify its existence. If it pays, it stays. Well, I'm arguing that this is part of the colonizing mindset because it is an orientation toward use that has almost no culturally enforced limitations. In a culture of extraction and colonization, everything becomes a resource. And if it's within reach, you use it up, use it until it's used up, and then you move on to the next valley or the next continent. Creating scarcity, in fact, is good for the bottom line. It creates GDP and drives the need to colonize and dominate other places and nations. Of course, Western Europeans don't have the exclusive copyright on colonizing. It's been practiced all over the planet throughout our history as hominids. But we are the ones who have weaponized it with the global marketplace and some powerful technologies to the point where this lens on the world is now becoming itself an existential threat. Relating to the more than human world this way means that it's no longer a wonder or even the medium in which we have our being. Instead, it's an instrument outside ourselves which we wield. Seeing nature as an instrument to be used has come to dominate our regard for the more than human world, including the way we conduct our science and conservation policy. Biologists used to examine the stomach contents of songbirds to count the weed seeds and pest insects that they consume, and then to extrapolate the results into estimates of economic value that a single bird represents to a farmer for weed and pest control. In its most extreme form in conservation, we have the wise use movement that was very popular with governments for a while, but it's still there in our modern arguments for ecological goods and services payments and marketplace instruments. And it's there in our cost-benefit analyses that we use to register pesticides and other toxic compounds we are introducing into the world. But of course, once you've swallowed the assumptions of economics, it does make complete sense, and it has its own internal logic and pragmatism. Within the machinery of our techno-industrial civilization of limitless growth and wealth generation through resource extraction, if you want to save a species or a river or a grassland, people are going to expect an economic argument proving its human utility. It kind of works up to a point. This utilitarian instrumentalist approach has managed to convince governments and industry to save some scraps of the natural world from development. But when it works at all, it's when governments that are willing to take the right steps enact conservation policy on crown land that's under threat from a relatively small number of corporate business interests. For example, in the boreal forests, where a few forestry companies can be regulated, we get things like the Forest Stewardship Council and so on that can have some good effects. But where this approach fails in particular, I believe, is on privately owned and managed lands where there are thousands of landowner operators that you have to regulate, most of whom are very averse to any kind of regulation, or they just don't have the staff or profit margins that allow them to dedicate resources to compliance in the way that a big corporation would. Which pretty well describes one of the reasons it's been difficult to make progress on private farmland applying our standard economic utilitarian approaches to conservation. Up against the stronger economic arguments mounted by industry and agriculturalists, conservation doesn't really stand a chance. It's always going to lose out. Over time, the utility of keeping nature on farmland will be replaced by technological fixes that are backed by stronger utilitarian pragmatist arguments. Elements in nature that we once thought we needed soon become obsolete. Biologists have more or less stopped counting the weed seeds and bugs inside a songbird's belly. Because who needs economically valuable birds if you've got herbicides and pesticides that do a better job, or at least in the short term, reflected in balance sheets? Who needs organic matter in the soil if you can replace it with artificial fertilizers that create higher yields year after year? The economic argument applied in cost-benefit analyses will ensure that even if we do ban one generation of pesticides, neonics, for example, there will always be a replacement that will be just as effective and toxic. Economic efficiency has become so dominant and pervasive in agriculture that it's fostering a culture that assumes natural cover on the land is always a liability, even when the data shows it isn't. So for some farmers, there's now such strong drive to sterilize their landscape that even when you show them the spreadsheet proving the dollars they would save by leaving some bush or sloughs, they won't listen. It's not always about being rational. It's about what the culture endorses, about values. The wider economy and local cultural values reward and honor the farmer who farms clean from one edge of the field to the other. But the colonizing mindset behind this direction in agriculture globally, I think, is now finally hitting its limits as we run out of arable land and continue to foul our own nest and pollute our waterways. One of the great disappointments of modernity is that the instrumentalizing economies and technologies that got us here, that painted us into this corner, seem completely unable to figure out how we can survive without clean water, air, and reasonably hospitable climate. At the same time, it seems like conservation efforts have gone as far as they can by applying arguments and tools designed to work within economies still driven by extractivism and colonial settler legacy. So where am I going with this? Well, I'm not going to propose specific solutions or even vague ones, but I've been arguing that the way we see and talk about the natural world has gotten us into trouble. So I guess I have to say something about an alternative lens and language. And this is not second nature for me. I've been as immersed as anyone in the settler extractive economy and its approaches to conservation. But we created these wicked problems together. We painted ourselves into a corner and we're all holding brushes. So we're going to have to solve them together. And that'll take collaboration and a willingness to talk and listen to one another from all sides. And I think it's going to take some imagination. As I was preparing for this talk, it was just before Christmas. Snow was falling softly outside the window. Softly and steadily, those big flakes for the whole day, those mesmerizing, weightless snowflakes. You know the ones I'm talking about. My first instinct was to apply the old lens and language, you know, the snow is going to cost the city hundreds of thousands of dollars to remove. But my second thought was, if enough of it falls, it'll fill up some of the sloughs. Maybe the muskrats will return to the marshes that I pay attention to. That's kind of an ecosystem service. Maybe this local ski club will groom the trails so I can get out and ski. That'd be nice. But then I tried to shift my perspective a bit. And I started to think that the utility of something like snow fades into the background when you do that. Something that just falls from the sky, something that despite all our efforts, we can neither summon nor halt, begins to look like something else. It begins to look like a gift, something that is given from the indifferent generosity of the earth and its processes, well beyond human grasping. It starts to look like a gift from life processes that we cannot completely possess or convert into commodity or property. Now, of course, corporations, as we know, are currently purchasing water rights, so the colonizing extractive economy will create and can create illusory but legal constructs to commodify almost anything that they can make scarce and therefore profitable. But almost all of us agree that that purchase of water rights is immoral and it's an offense on so many levels. To privatize, it should be free for all of us and then sell it back to us as profit. Most of us will see that as an outrage. Not everybody, but most people, I think, will see that as an outrage. And that alone gives me hope, because if we can recognize clean water as a gift no one should be able to possess exclusively at the expense of the wider community of beings, there's at least the possibility that we might one day extend that same ethic to soil, habitat, and wildlife. If we can find the place within us where we see and talk about water as a free gift of the earth and its life, we may also be able to do the same in our regard for other beings, plants, animals, and the ecosystems that they depend upon. Along with the lens and language of gift, rather than resource, comes the shift from focusing on scarcity and instead starting to see the abundance around us. That even though we have lost a lot in our prairie landscapes, there are signs of abundance around us. So I'm going to try to use the rest of my time to convince you that the Aspen Parkland prairie pothole region is still a place of great abundance. That despite being one of the most intensely altered landscapes on the continent, there's still a lot left here. And it's as good a landscape as any, I believe, to start seeing with fresh eyes, to start addressing with new language. Whether it's the millions of little wetlands, the aspen groves, the coulees and river valleys, or the grasses that grow around and in between, or the soil itself, all of the gifts of this ecoregion can be traced back to the glaciers that set the stage. But you know, when you live in a place like this, you live your whole life here, you can lose perspective, really, on how unique it is. There are only a few places on the planet with this kind of dimpled, glaciated landscape with an abundance of small pothole wetlands, marking the depressions, of course, left by the glaciers as they melted back a few thousand years ago. And it's just a few thousand years ago. This is a fresh landscape. In geological time, it was formed virtually yesterday, and it's still maturing. I think about this most when I travel to other parts of the continent, other parts of the world, because I'll always notice how few wetlands there are, and I'm always wondering, where's the ducks? Where are the geese? And then I remember, oh yeah, I live in a place that's different. It's pretty unique. I think we take for granted our river valleys as well. The South Saskatchewan River, the Assiniboine, the Capel, Pipestone, Souris, all their tributaries, all of it stitching the Aspen Parkland region together with a network of water and woodland and grassland. These are some of the planet's best examples of post-glacial meltwater channels. Then there's the pattern of woodland and grassland itself, these island-like tree groves amid grassland. Cultural geographers say that it hits our aesthetic sweet spot for attractive landscapes. It's the way we design our urban parks and golf courses around the world. Gently rolling terrain, lots of open landscape with grass, little woodland groves and ponds here and there. Well, here in Saskatchewan, we've got it in the Aspen Parkland in nature. It's one of the best places to see a natural mix of all these elements. And that abundance I'm talking about comes from rich soils and adequate precipitation, but it's also from being what we call an ecotone, a transitional space between the open, drier plains to the south, the boreal forest to the north, but also in the microhabitats between the grass and the trees. In fact, the Aspen Parkland makes up the most extensive boreal grassland transition zone in the world. Almost all of it is in Canada. The parkland that First Nations people knew here first was a kind of savanna, and it's easy to forget that until recently it hosted tremendous herds of grazing animals, forming one of the richest regions of the Great Plains. There's only a few places where you can almost get an impression of what that original abundance was like in the Aspen Parkland, what it might have been like. One of those places is the mosaic of aspen woods and fescue grasslands in the southwest corner of Prince Albert National Park, where one of Canada's last free-roaming herds of bison are just barely hanging on to existence. Fescue grew on some of the prairie's best soils, so elsewhere there's very little of it, almost none of it left. Some of the continent's last wild bison, they're grazing some of the last fescue grassland. It's a rare expression of what's still there deep in the soil of Aspen Parkland. Its capacity to grow those rich northern grasses that flourished with the bison for thousands of years. That hasn't gone anywhere. It's still in the soil. The second place I'd like to mention is the Nature Conservancy of Canada's Fort Ellis property, just over the border in Manitoba from Saskatchewan. Now, bison have been replaced by cattle there at Fort Ellis, but there's still this tremendous richness there of the aspen forests, the wetlands, they're down in the valley, and then the grasslands above on the plains. It's right beside the Ellis Archie Community Pasture in Manitoba, former PFRA pasture, which is a sandy plain with grasses that are a little more typical of mixed grass prairie than fescue. This last summer, I had a chance to do some audio recording there, which was a new thing for me, and I had lots of fun recording bird sounds and animal sounds for Audible. The program is called Wild Sounds of Canada. It was just released last month. Anyway, the bird song at dawn at Fort Ellis was very impressive. But what I love about Aspen Parkland and places like this always is the mix of birds you see in proximity to one another. So up in the prairie, I'm recording spragues, pipits, grassland birds, like marble godwits, meadowlarks, and chestnut-colored longspurs. But right there, beside them, on the rim of the valley nearby, I was able to record rose-breasted grosbeaks, ovenbirds, black and white warblers, and I got a beautiful recording of a scarlet tanager. Woodland and grassland birds right beside one another. This doesn't happen just any old place on the continent. It happens in Aspen Parkland. There was a bunch of wood warblers right in the valley bottom as well, northern water thrushes, redstarts, and a mourning warbler. This kind of mix and diversity of breeding birds in summer, I think, is a testimony to the productivity in Aspen Parkland. You don't find that kind of abundance of birds if you travel to the boreal forest or in alpine areas in the mountains. And that diversity and richness is directly related to the complexity you get in these transitions between wet areas, grassy areas, and wooded areas. All of those places where wetlands and coulees and potholes give away to pastures, to meadows, and aspen groves. It makes for a tough and resilient landscape, even after all these years of us working it with agriculture and with all introduced plants that are now getting into pastures and meadows and woods. Aspen trees themselves are very impressive when you look at them. They're a common tree across the continent, but their ecology is fascinating. They co-evolved with fire. They naturally have a higher water content, and they don't contain those volatile chemical compounds that make conifers so very flammable. They provide shade for a cooler, more humid environment in the underbrush. And all these things are making foresters now say that it might have been a big mistake for them to be removing aspen in all the commercial forests, which has been a forestry practice for decades. They're saying that aspen on the edges may act as a natural fire break, and if more aspen had been left in our forests, we probably wouldn't be having the kind of damage we're seeing with our annual summer fires in the West. And for a fire to destroy an aspen forest, it takes just the right conditions. And even then, they recover very quickly by producing suckers from their horizontal roots. When you look at a uniform stand of aspen, you're seeing trees that are probably all the same age, likely because they all developed after the last same fire or some other disturbance. And they may even share the same genetic makeup because, as we know, they're often clones of the same parent. Despite producing 1.5 million seeds a year, the mature trees in aspen bluffs usually produce from vegetative suckering or cloning. Precipitation plays an interesting role in this kind of ebb and flow between grassland and the aspen groves. In wet years, aspen will march out into the surrounding grassland, Suckers can shoot 25 meters from the parent plant and grow 3 meters a year in a single year if it's wet enough. In dry years, of course, the grass is favored and the aspens will retreat. If droughts are long enough, aspen groves will die back, letting grasses take over. So the aspen trees are always kind of living on the edge, right? In a climate that's not ideal growing conditions for them. But that's what makes it an interesting transition zone in flux, the marginal climate for both grass and trees responding to disturbances and changing conditions, part of the unique quality of this ecoregion. Okay, so here I am. I've been suggesting that the economic pragmatic arguments we usually use in conservation are not going to work on their own. We need to find a new lens for looking at landscapes and ecosystems under threat. I'm saying that it's maybe not too late to shift to a language of gift and abundance that would let us see the land as unique and worthy of being included in our moral universe. But will this work? Will it make any difference? Well, I think there's some evidence that some of the biggest environmental victories that we've seen in recent decades have been won not by economic pragmatic thinking, but by idealists who did what they could to open the hearts and minds of people to something under threat and bringing nature into our moral universe. The great whales, humpbacks, blue whales, sperm whales, and others were on the brink, as we all know, in the 1970s and early 80s. But today, humpbacks are back to 93% of their original numbers, while gray whales and certain populations of southern right whales and blue whales are also recovering quite well. But the whales didn't recover because we realized we needed them for pollination or water quality or carbon sequestration. They recovered because a few crazy dedicated people saw what was happening and they got the message out. It wasn't about making policy changes based on calculating the economic value of a whale or some kind of cost-benefit analysis weighing the trade-off between the whaling industry's GDP and the estimated value of having some whales in our oceans. It was about really listening to and seeing whales as they are for their own being. And I mean literally listening to whales. It started with an interest in whale song. Exactly 50 years ago, last month, a record album was released, Songs of the Humpback Whale, the only multi-platinum selling album of animal sounds ever. The album inspired the movement to protect whales, and it led to Greenpeace's activism. In fact, Greenpeace would broadcast the songs from the album to Russian whaling ships. But it was much more than activism on the high seas. In some ways, the activism was just a foot in the door of public awareness. The real progress, I believe, was made through public awareness campaigns. The whole Save the Whales movement of the 70s and 80s got more and more people to open their hearts to the possibility that whales are not some kind of resource to be exploited, to make a shift in how they see whales, to see that they are something to be treasured and protected for their own sake. Since then, through film and other media, and then eventually through whale watching tours, so many more people have come to know now what whales are like, the power and wonder of these great creatures, and to take steps to defend them and to urge their governments to do so. Pragmatism and economic arguments, in this case, were trumped by public awareness and moral persuasion. In fact, all the best pragmatic and economic arguments were used to defend the whaling industry. It employs people, it creates GDP, it feeds the hungry, it's part of the culture of this or that nation. These same rational economic arguments have been used to justify the destruction of old growth forests. They're used right now to excuse the drainage of entire watersheds or the plowing of ancient grasslands. These arguments sustained the whaling industry too for a long time, until enough people began to see what was happening and change their way of looking at things. Governments were convinced to protect whales not by pragmatism and economic thinking, but because enough people were able to abandon that particular lens on life long enough to change the way they look at whales. Historians tell us that it was a shift, a real shift in our environmental consciousness. We may not be having this discussion today if it hadn't been for that movement. It was a moment when more of us started to see that nature is not a bunch of resources, but a community of priceless gifts that do not belong to anyone. So how do we get that shift in perspective to happen, not for whales, but for entire landscapes that are just as threatened as the great whales, and maybe more so? So that we can find ways to conduct agriculture that will not destroy entire watersheds and strip townships of most of their natural cover. I don't know exactly, but that's precisely the work ahead of us. It will take collaboration that will include and value all our systems of knowledge, wisdom, and ethics across the divides that separate science and traditional knowledge, non-Indigenous and Indigenous. I'm going to take a little break now from talking and ask Caitlin to start a 3-minute video that I made about a year ago, showing us some of the gifts of water and wetlands in the prairies. Okay, thanks, Caitlin. I'm going to try to wrap up quickly here so we have some time to talk. On Boxing Day, I received a message telling me about a new landfill proposed for a piece of grassland near Avonlea. This is not an Aspen Parkland, it's really just south of it in the mixed grass prairie. But the property itself, where they're proposing this landfill, is mostly non-native grass, but there are 80 acres of native grass there, and perhaps worse, it borders on one of the last large expanses of native grassland anywhere near Regina. A beautiful community pasture called Caledonia Elmsthorpe, one of the prettiest community pastures, I think, in the region. There's several endangered species on that pasture making their last stand. And there is a sharp-tailed grouse dancing ground right on the land proposed for the landfill. The landfill is going to be owned and operated by Loras Disposal, and it's meant to serve us in Regina and the people of Moose Jaw. Some of us are citizens of those cities. It'll be our trash hauled by truck to the new landfill and scattering over the fence onto the native grassland of Caledonia Elmsthorpe. if we want to, as Barry Lopez suggests, include landscapes like these in our moral universe, we can't let these kinds of things happen. We just can't, without speaking up for the sharp-tailed grouse and the native grassland on and around the property. It's a truism of environmental concerns everywhere that we're beginning to treat the earth, we've been treating the earth like a garbage dump. There's just too many examples close to home where that's not merely a figure of speech anymore. A new lens and new language may not on their own transform our use of the water, grassland, and bush, but it might give us ways to at least see the work ahead of us and why it cannot be merely turned aside by economics that favor land abuse. It will not overnight replace the dominant view of land that it currently drives most decision-making, but it might nurture an alternative culture that will grow right alongside the extracted one and one day take its place. I'm going to close with one last little story about Willie Niven, the naturalist farmer from Shiho. This is a photo that was included in the Blue Jay the day he died in 2002 in his obituary in the Blue Jay. So in that obituary, it was said that William could whistle bird songs to you. He could clap out the rhythm of their wing beat or the pattern of the notes that they sang. If there's any possibility of us finding a new way to look at the prairie, its wetlands, grasslands, and bush, this is where it starts, with more people paying attention, listening, and finding that kind of intimate connection and relationship with the others who share this land. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to hear some of your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Trevor, for that presentation. You've touched on a lot of different things there, such as just utilitarianism in our culture, maybe our human-centered approach, the inherent value in our local ecosystems. There's lots there to think about. So I just encourage people, if you have any thoughts, any comments, any questions, please feel free to type them in the question box on the GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll have a discussion here for the next 10-15 minutes. All right. So the first question that came in here is more from a practical perspective, actually, but simply just by ignoring the legislation that we have passed to protect wetlands and Aspen Parkland, are Saskatchewan farmers and maybe even politicians risking changing our ecozones from a more relatively humid region of productive farmland to dry land prairie, requiring more irrigation to maintain its productivity? So I think this was specifically with regards to your example with the forestry industry and removing the Aspen Parkland or the Aspen trees. Are we seeing similar dynamics with farmland as well?
Wow, that's a question for a geographer and a scientist who would really know. I think you certainly hear speculation about that. You hear certainly with climate change discussions that Aspen Parkland has shifted quite a bit, is still shifting and changing. We may see grassland, under climate change invade further north, or sort of grassland ecology or the requirements for grasslands move further north. But I'm just not qualified to answer that kind of a technical question. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. All right. Okay. So, sorry, lots of questions coming in. Thank you. Keep them coming, you guys. The next question that we have here is regarding maybe more of the cultural shift that you're talking about being more connected to the land. I think it's fair to say that we're seeing that more and more people are feeling disconnected to the land, whether it's, being in an urban setting, but even I would say children as well. I know in the work that we do is we see a lot of children don't necessarily know how to play in nature anymore these days. And so do you have any comments about how you see just culture being more disconnected to the land, and or do you have any comments on how to foster a better relationship with our natural ecosystems?
Right. Thanks, Lindsay. Certainly, we're seeing some good things happening. I think especially during this last year with COVID-19, we're seeing a lot of people starting to get outdoors more. I just see it in my neighborhood. The park nearby, I went out with my granddaughter the other day to try to play fox and goose in the in the snow. And you need a big clear area so you can make pathways. I couldn't find a clear area because it's all covered with footprints. People are outside more this year than ever, and I hope that continues, and they'll discover that's an important part of their lives. And I'm seeing more people take up bird watching, and then there's always hope that once they do that, they'll see that the birds are declining and that there's something that they can do to help, and that we need to be working with our governments and policymakers in those directions. I'm seeing Nature Saskatchewan and Nature Regina introduce new programs with young families that are getting them outside. There's some really good stuff happening here with a group in Regina. All right, I hope to get my granddaughter out there with them sometime soon. There's changes that way, but I think the change we need to see, of course, has to happen fast, and it has to happen at government levels. So some of the most important things we can do is to work in advocacy and speaking to our policymakers and decision makers, and we've got to keep the pressure on that we need to take responsibility for climate change and biodiversity collapse in our corner of the world, and do what we can, protect more wild landscapes, and make sure that there are programs in place so that isn't going to hurt farmers and be on their backs. They are the ones providing us and many other people with the food. So we've got to bring them along in the discussion in ways so that any changes that happen will not make it impossible for them to be making a living as producers.
And you made a comment actually in your presentation about the scarcity mindset, and I thought that was very, very pertinent, that when you get into a scarcity mindset, I think then sometimes things become adversarial, right? You become very, feels like there's not enough, right? And so our next question here is just about how do you bring people together, essentially, whether that's bringing politicians out in terms of fostering a culture where policymakers are spending time on the ground. And do you have any comments or personal experience? I think how do we create maybe when there's a lack of awareness in the impacts on the ground of our policy? How do we create more awareness, whether that's with the policymakers or with industry leaders?
Right. Well, I think Saskatchewan's a pretty small place with only a couple of degrees of separation between most of us, and so a lot of us who are, conservation minded probably know somebody who knows somebody who's a politician or is working in government at a high level. And why don't we all make a commitment to take some of them out to see what's happening to the prairie, to take some of them out to see the difference between birdsong on a canola field and the birdsong just across the road to where there's, better habitat, to really show the difference and to see what's happening with the drainage issues in this province. I think firsthand experience is crucial, and often human beings don't understand things. I think that's what happened with the great whales, is that people started to see it certainly through the media, and then more people went out and actually saw what a whale is like and realized that it was not just a resource.
That's very fair. I know in my own personal conversations, whenever I mention work, around wetland drainage in Saskatchewan, the first thing that comes up is people saying, I grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan and I love those wetlands, whether it was skating on the pond, in the wintertime, or going and watching the birds. And so those stories are there, and they do come out, I think, quite frequently, definitely.
Yeah.
We have lots of questions here, Trevor, around the landfill proposal. People are wondering how they can get involved. People are wondering whether there's been an environmental assessment. So I'm wondering if you want to just chat more about that.
Okay, I'm not directly involved. One of the people on our board has been quite involved with it. It's a Facebook group that is established mostly with the landowners right around there who are very upset and concerned about the potential issues that would be caused by having a huge landfill right beside them. And they're concerned about the sharp-tailed grouse lek, and they're concerned about the Caledonia Elmthorpe pasture. So it's a Facebook group. If anybody wants, I haven't got the link right with me handy, but if anybody wants, they can contact me at trevorherriot@gmail.com, and I can give them the link to that Facebook page, and they could find out more information there. On the topic of environmental impact assessment, of course, that's something that that they are hoping to advance or put pressure on governments to make sure that that actually would happen. But I think one of the key approaches here is, I don't even know if, because this is all being done by LORAS, who has the contract for the cities of Regina and Moose Jaw, but I wonder how many councillors really know about what's happening here. So I would say speak to your city councillor in Moose Jaw and Regina and tell them you're concerned.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit here. So one person made a very interesting comment here. So instead of focusing on different individual species, would it not make more of an impact or make more sense to look at functioning ecosystems? So looking at this landscape approach and maybe taking into consideration also species interacting. So we've learned to look at species as individuals and looking at a whole landscape approach. Would that maybe emphasize or drive the point home for individuals at what's the beauty of what we're seeing, but also what's that risk of being lost?
Yeah, completely. Because if you look at the individual species in Aspen Parkland, you can always say, oh, well, you know, they're not the charismatic megafauna. There's no grizzly bears, there's no whales. And it's just, you know, little dicky birds and ducks and so on, which we could say are common around the continent. But it's the uniqueness of that landscape and its ecosystem and its geological history and the gifts that it brings to this part of the world. That's what needs to be focused on. So working at the landscape level and getting people excited about and proud of our landscapes here, and to see that they really are unique. You don't see this kind of dimpled wetland landscape in any other parts of the world. This we sometimes call the duck factory or the prairie pothole region is truly amazing when you look around us and try to find any replacement for it. Once it's gone, there isn't going to be any substitute for it. So yeah, it's the landscape and the larger sort of ecosystems that we need to focus on and somehow get them to be charismatic or interesting, and that people will feel sort of some pride and some you know, sense of wanting to protect it.
Yeah, and we have another comment here also about how these ecosystems, and I would even argue species, they don't stop at provincial boundaries. And so I don't know if there's any comments that you'd like to make about this larger perspective of grasslands as a whole and the prairie pothole region as a whole, and working with whether it's provinces or even different countries here.
Right, and there's lots of good transboundary work. There's a transboundary grasslands group that gets together every couple of years. I've gone to a couple of their gatherings, and so it's folks from Montana, the Dakotas, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba sometimes. And there's other transboundary initiatives that are going on. Those need more support and resourcing, of course. And in the Aspen Parkland, to really deal with the Aspen Parkland as a whole, we'd need to include, you know, everybody from Minnesota through Manitoba, Saskatchewan, all the way into the Peace River country in Alberta to really embrace the whole of the Aspen Parkland ecoregion. It's important, yeah.
Awesome. We have another great question here, and I think it's a great one to end on. So the commentator says, I appreciate your mention of the farmers and landowners who are already in this conservation mindset, and they're talking about how, you know, there's a goal of creating policy change and approaching politicians, but also emphasizing just the point of leading by example. And so this person is asking, are there any platforms where like-minded landowners can connect and share success stories, whether that's in education or conservation, ultimately in an effort to normalize these conversations within the agricultural community? That's
great. I want to meet the person who said that. that's exactly what we need. And of course, I'm an urban guy. I don't farm anything. I used to keep bees, but I got no cattle or anything like that. So definitely, that's what's needed. It would be lovely if rural people who are like-minded on these issues, who are protecting habitat and see the value of it, and then all the people involved in regenerative agriculture, if they could get a higher profile and be more connected to one another, and sort of escape the sort of individualist approach that's in our culture and start to work collaboratively connect with First Nations, connect with urban people, and show us what you're doing. We could celebrate it and support it. And we'd have something to point to, and then to talk to our policymakers about. And it would be part of something that also is unique and something that can be celebrated in our understanding of nature. Nature isn't something apart from people. People are there. Farming has to be there in a sustainable way.
Awesome. And I just see there's an incoming comment here from Young Agrarians making a plug here. So you can always connect with Young Agrarians if you would like to talk with more like-minded farmers. So okay. There you go.
Good.
Well, Young I'm just mindful of. Perfect. Yeah. It's always good to connect at conferences like these. I'm mindful of the time, so we are at 11:30 here. So I'll just close this presentation with a few closing remarks. I just want to say thank you to everyone. Lots of wonderful comments in the question box, and thank you, Trevor, again for your presentation, and you're leaving us with lots to think about. And if you have any other questions, feel free to do pop them into the question box, and I will pass them on to Trevor after the presentation. So if you have any last comments, please feel free to pop them in there. All right. So again, I just want to close our session just by reminding you guys that we have, sorry, I'm on the wrong side, but I'll just say this because I think most people know. If you'd like to register for our upcoming, there you go, for our upcoming sessions this week, you can do that at sierraclub.ca. For some more background information on farmland drainage and some of the imperatives around this issue, you can check that out. It's posted on the Environmental Society website, and the name is the Institute Support. And of course, if you're looking for any recordings of any of our past and or future presentations, they will be housed on Citizens Environmental Alliance Saskatchewan's YouTube channel. We'll be putting them, all the presentations that have happened both in December and this January session. They'll be there by the end of the week here. So we, of course, just need to thank all of our partners who have come together to make this conference a possibility. So lots of people to thank. We, of course, want to thank our main organizers, Citizens Environmental Alliance, and our many partners, Colleen Lake Eco Museum, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Last Mountain Lake Stewardship Group, the Lower Capel Watershed Stewards, Nature Saskatchewan, PPPI, Trevor, thanks, Saskatchewan Environmental Society, Sierra Club Canada Foundation, Sloughs, and Saskatoon Wildlife Federation. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us for our future sessions. With that, I'll say have a good day and take care.